Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We'll get started in about a minute, but for today, there will be a Q&A at the end, so you can use the Q&A chat function on your window, and you can type in any questions that you have, and we'll be able to answer them at the end of the webinar.
So let's get started. We represent MedCrypt, but we also support the MedISAO, which is a subsidiary, if you will, of MedCrypt. We will walk through what today's regulatory landscape is looking like for medical device manufacturers who need to maintain cybersecurity for their devices, and we'll do introductions first. Next slide. My name is Naomi Schwartz. I spent 6.5 years at FDA prior to coming to MedCrypt last August. I was reviewing diabetes diagnostic and therapeutic devices, so some of the most interconnected devices with some of the most stringent cybersecurity requirements. Probably the first devices that actually had special controls specific to cybersecurity for the interoperability aspects. And I've spent more than 20 years doing systems engineering. Participant in the IEEE P2621 standards and recommended practice for wireless diabetes device security. Reviewed the MDDT qualification for MITRE's rubric for applying CVSS to medical devices. That's a post-market medical device development tool. It is not intended for pre-market use. I've managed post-market triage for cybersecurity vulnerability disclosure in diabetes devices and other in vitro diagnostics, and I led the review of one of the first Class 2 recalls for cybersecurity in connected insulin pumps. And Axel will introduce himself.
Thanks, Naomi. So I'm the other presenter, Axel Worth, Chief Security Strategist here at MedCrypt. A couple of things on my bio. I've spent my entire career, literally first job out of college, in the medical device industry. I've worked on the imaging side as well as diagnostics, monitoring, health IT. And back in 2008, ended up in cybersecurity with focus on the healthcare space, and very quickly actually got confronted with cybersecurity problems of medical devices, and that topic has since then increased in relevance for me personally, but also obviously for the larger industry. And yeah, that is what we're going to be speaking about today. So quickly, background about MedISAO. ISAOs in general originated back in 2015 under the executive order, basically with the idea to promote cybersecurity information sharing and to encourage the development in information sharing organizations. They exist across industries, they exist across government structures. So we need to talk about cybersecurity if we want to win this cyber war, and that was the idea back behind ISAOs. So an ISAO is supposed to gather, analyze, and communicate critical cyber information, and then share that information across members, but also then with federal, state, or local governments, law enforcement, and similar. Specifically, MedISAO, which together with HISAC, under an MOU with the FDA, is covering the medical device industry. So MedISAO specifically is targeted to support small to medium-sized medical device manufacturers. Help you stay informed, like we do today in this webinar, about regulatory and business changes and security needs. Talk about how to leverage best practices in information sharing and cybersecurity, how to avoid costly vulnerability reporting procedures, like, for example, recalls and similar, by participating in an ISAO. And also one of the services we offer is the use of a coordinated vulnerability disclosure process as part of you as a manufacturer communicating to your customers. last background slide before we dive in. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the regulatory space right now on cybersecurity. We can only touch on a few regulations, and even within those regulations, can touch only on a few aspects. So therefore, what we are presenting today by no means can be considered regulatory or legal guidance. So please seek expert counsel if you make specific business or regulatory decisions. Also, we will talk about a broad range of regulations and changes that are happening in the industry right now. Not every one of them will affect every company directly. And then we'll talk about applicability in a moment here. But I think across the topics we have selected here, and your role as a medical device manufacturer as an in-between in your up and downstream supply chain, I think there will be more or less direct or indirect impact of any of the examples we'll be talking about here. Right? Your suppliers may be affected, and that impacts you, or your customers may be affected, and that again will impact you. As we have seen over the last decade, but certainly increasingly over the past year or two, cybersecurity regulations are very much in flux. They develop rapidly, things are happening very quickly. And we focused on recent developments here with a selection of topics we're going to talk about. But anything we present to you needs to be looked at in the context of a given countries, the US, EU, and other examples. We're picking broader ongoing efforts on cybersecurity. Right? So a given regulation and a given example here should not be looked at as the only thing. It is something that relates to the regulatory history in your region, and something that will relate to the regulatory and legal future in your region. And then lastly, to make clear that these regulations and laws usually have some boundaries. So they may not apply to all industries or everybody. So for example, if you're already regulated as a medical device manufacturer, some other regulations that are on the horizon right now may not impact you. You may be excluded because you are already regulated. But that is not always the case. So we have both an exclusive but also inclusive relationships between the different regulations. So diving right in, we'll start over in Europe with the recently released update to the Network and Information Security Directive, shortly called NIS2, came out in January and is basically applicable in all EU member states and is currently being transferred into national laws, and that process is expected to complete by 2024. NIS2 affects all medium and large critical infrastructure industries, including healthcare, medical device manufacturers, biotech, pharma, the supply chain, but also service providers and hosting providers and so forth. Basically, any company with more than 250 employees or more than 50 million euros in turnover. It covers risk management and governance, overall regulatory oversight and enforcement, incident handling and reporting, aspects of business continuity, things like backup and recovery, extensively talks about the supply chain and how to manage your supply chain risk as a manufacturer of critical infrastructure devices, gives advice on vulnerability handling and disclosure, talks about cybersecurity hygiene, cybersecurity education for your staff, as well as auditing, and specific security topics include things like cryptography. There are also notification requirements to the local computer security incident response teams in Europe within 24 hours of a suspected incident and 72 hours after the initial assessment with a more complete update. Fines, as we have seen, for example, with GDPR, the European Data Privacy Regulations, fines can be quite steep, depending on whether you're classified as an essential entity or an important entity, and NIS2 gives definitions of those. the fines can be as high as 10 million euros or 2% of turnover, or whichever of those two is greater. And also interesting to note is that under NIS2, senior management is personally accountable for cybersecurity in the company. Another thing that is going on in Europe right now is the transition from the old MDD to the new MDR and IVDR regulations. Basically, they are in force now. They are applicable since 2021, 2022, except for devices that were previously certified under MDD. That deadline for compliance and recertification under MDR was recently, a few weeks ago, extended to 2027 and 28, depending on device type and device risk. But then there's a whole slew of exceptions that need to be considered. For example, if your MDD certification expires, then you need to recertify under MDR, or if you have an update that requires recertification, that also needs to happen under MDR. And the link here at the bottom of the page is a very, very good review of all the nitty-gritty details on which date applies to you in your situation as a manufacturer and to your devices. Basically, it applies to all medical devices that are produced or imported and distributed in the European Union. There's another white paper type document out there, the MDCG 2019-16, which is basically an interpretation of MDR and IVDR. So MDR, IVDR is the legal background, is not specific to cybersecurity. It talks about safety and all aspects of medical device management. But again, MDCG 16 is specifically the cybersecurity interpretation of the laws. Talks about pre and post market requirements that need to be addressed, the consideration around reasonably foreseeable misuse, things like hackers and malware on devices, for example. It does state, interesting enough, that there needs to be a balance between too weak security, which could lead to malicious modification of a device on one hand, but then also too restrictive security on the other hand, that could potentially impact patient safety through, for example, delayed data access or delayed logon of a clinical care provider. It talks extensively about post-market vigilance and management, basically security maintenance, incident response, trend reporting, and so forth. And it also includes things like physical security, role-based access control, network access, patch management, malware protection, and so forth. So there's a lot of technical detail in the appendix there. Notification is required to customers and also government agencies as part of your post-market surveillance and vigilance, which also includes then things like vulnerability remediation, patch release, incident response, and so forth. The biggest risk, I think, under MDR is around delay in market access or loss of market access, product recalls, design changes that may be forced on you, litigation, but there is also risk of fines for violations. Now moving over to Asia Pacific, and I like to look at Australia there as a good example. Australia has done an excellent job developing very pragmatic and practical and usable cybersecurity regulations over the last couple of years, including cybersecurity guidance for medical devices. But the one I want to talk about here is basically the Critical Infrastructure Risk Management Program, which was just launched in February. It takes 6 months to become effective, so companies need to comply within 6 months, which is actually fairly aggressive schedule, and it basically applies to all critical infrastructure companies, including healthcare, but also companies that provide, for example, data storage and processing to critical infrastructure industries. And very similar to what we talked about earlier, it extensively talks about risk management, identification of hazards, minimize and eliminate any risk as reasonably practical, mitigation of hazards to the critical infrastructure, which again includes healthcare, but many other industries, establishes a baseline standard for cyber physical personnel and supply chain security, talks about the identification of hazards, minimization and elimination of material risks and the mitigation of impact, and requires annual reporting as well as demonstrated compliance with ISO 27001 or NIST. I assume they mean NIST CSF by that, but that was not clear in the document, or an equivalent standard, which obviously is a fairly vague definition, within 18 months, which again is probably fairly aggressive. Notification are required annually, as well as for specific cybersecurity incidents within 72 hours, but within 12 hours for critical cybersecurity incidents. And what the definition of critical incidents is, please refer to the document. Fines can be a few 10,000 Australian dollars for individual violations, but up to 275,000 Australian dollars for failure to implement and comply with this regulation. So again, and this is just one of many, and there's more to come in Australia. Look at it in the context of the recent history, as well as the future of cybersecurity regulation in that market. And other countries are taking similar action in Asia Pacific, Japan, China, Singapore, South Korea, and so forth. So it's certainly not that Australia stands alone. I just wanted to take them here as an example. Now we're going to be closer to home, talk about the US. Recently released and expected to become effective in April, but we don't know that for sure yet, is an SEC proposed rule on cybersecurity risk management that affects all US public companies. It requires public disclosure regarding cybersecurity risk management strategy and governance, and periodic disclosure of, as part of a company's annual report, policies and procedures to identify and manage cybersecurity risks, management's role in implementing cybersecurity policies, and board of directors cybersecurity expertise and its oversight of cybersecurity risks. So clearly they're making it also here a management executive responsibility. Includes notification requirement, disclosure to via SEC filing to the public, but also reporting of material cybersecurity incidents within 4 days. Penalties are not defined in dollar amounts, but certainly can be applied. They can be impacting a company's listing status. And again, fines can be enforced, and we have seen with previous SEC cybersecurity regulations that they don't shy away from enforcing fines, and I assume they will do so in this case as well. And with that, I hand back to Naomi.
So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act was recently amended as part of the appropriations bill that was signed by the president in December of last year. And it's really important to be aware of the changes to the act as a result of this. It's giving FDA specific authority to enforce cybersecurity requirements in a handful of situations. So for cyber devices as defined in the appropriations bill, which contains software, may have vulnerabilities, and can be connected to the internet, these things apply. You need to demonstrate a capability to identify, assess, and respond to cybersecurity vulnerabilities. This includes vulnerability management, coordinated vulnerability disclosures, penetration testing as validation. It requires you to have demonstration of capability for reasonably regular software updates to address cybersecurity vulnerabilities. This is a reflection of the total product life cycle. And it really means that if you cannot do something like an over-the-air set of updates, which requires its own set of security, you need to have a very clearly stated process for removing devices from the market in order to patch them and then get back to the market. And it requires a software bill of materials, which in the past has been enforced in a patchwork way. There are groups with higher risk devices at FDA who are more persistent in asking for software bill of materials. Going forward, devices that meet those three characteristics will be required to provide software bill of materials to FDA. That does not mean that you're required to provide them to your clients, although it is often encouraged and your clients may ask for them. It is simply that FDA wants to see it. They want to track software bill of materials. They want to know when new disclosures may affect particularly high-risk devices. And so they're looking to ingest that in both machine-readable and human-readable formats. So if you have Cyclone DX or SPDX format, you need to also share with FDA an Excel spreadsheet, because a reviewer does not want to read Cyclone DX or SPDX. It's really hard to process. Suzanne Schwartz, who is pictured here, no relation to me, is the leader of cybersecurity efforts at CDRH. And she is really enthusiastic about this law because it gives her team and the review teams teeth in terms of ensuring that these devices are coming in with secure designs rather than security tacked on as an afterthought. So, it's really important to note, though, that the amendment to the Act does not affect any previous existing authorities that FDA has for regulating safety and effectiveness. All it's really stating is that this is no longer going to be collected as part of the quality system regulation content, your risk management approach. It is a separate set of documentation that needs to live on its own and demonstrate a long-term capability of ensuring devices that go to market will be maintainable and will maintain their security, especially as it affects safety for the long term. Next slide. So FDA has been increasing its focus and its authority on cybersecurity over the past few years. Some areas that have been really under target from FDA, automated insulin dosing systems, cardiac pacemakers, and neurostimulators, because they're all worn by patients in the home use environment, which is really insecure, and because they all use wireless connectivity to change parameters, to communicate with other devices. Those have historically received greater scrutiny from FDA. Under FDA's current existing authorities, it's tied to the quality system reg and those concepts of safety and effectiveness. You're really focused on responding to the recommended practices in the 2014 pre-market and the 2016 post-market guidance documents, but you're not necessarily going to see FDA ask for all of the documentation. There are additional guidance documents like the off-the-shelf software guidance and the interoperability guidance that also apply. I would expect in the future, as the pre-market cybersecurity guidance gets finalized, that you will start to see revisions on the others as well. Those documents have been the direction finding for manufacturers, but for certain devices moving forward, those are requirements, not recommendations anymore. The appropriations bill is finalized as of 90 days after signing. So March 29th, those pieces of the legislation, that amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, is final. And FDA now has the authority for cybersecurity requests in all new submissions, including supplements to pre-existing submissions, to ensure adequate cybersecurity hygiene as expressed in the appropriations bill. The final pre-market guidance should be produced by the end of September. That is required by the appropriations bill. FDA needs to provide that updated guidance, and they will probably need to clarify some aspects of the appropriations bill. For example, what does it mean to to state that a device can be connected to the internet? Are they talking about indirect connections as well as direct connections? Are they talking about disabled functionality that could be accidentally or maliciously re-enabled? If you have Wi-Fi but you've disabled it in the BIOS, does that count? They need to provide some clarification to those questions, and we expect that that will be provided in the final guidance by September. This means that FDA is not going to be slowly addressing the public comments over the past 2 draft versions of the guidance, though. They are going to rapidly have to resolve what will be in that content and get it published for your use. Presumably, this will interpret other language in the appropriations bill as well, and it leaves room for additional cybersecurity requirements levied by the HHS secretary. We don't know what that could entail. We can predict that it's going to largely follow other activities from the federal government driving cybersecurity requirements. Next slide. So today, FDA is looking for things like software bill of materials if it's provided as part of labeling to customers, if it's requested by a review branch, diabetes, for example. Known vulnerabilities should be documented. Manufacturers should be justifying why safety and essential performance are not affected by these known vulnerabilities. Typically, the known vulnerabilities are listed in the software bill of materials if it's asked for, but they should be included even if SBOM was not asked for. And any end of service software, typically if FDA asks about it, they want to know why it does not affect safety and essential performance. But they can deny a medical device coming to market on the basis of using end of service software. There are a lot of questions coming out of FDA today about, antiquated and obsolete operating systems, for example. So they're very, very attentive to that. By the end of March, you're going to see SBOM requested for all cyber devices as previously described. You're going to need to provide detail about how you will address known vulnerabilities. So it's not just acceptable to say we have them and we've done a risk analysis. You're going to need to state at what update cycle you are going to resolve them, and you're still going to have to justify not having done so immediately with a discussion about safety and essential performance impact. End of service software is probably going to be denied writ large today, though, by the end of March, because it's going to impact safety and essential performance at some point. In the future, we're not sure exactly how soon in the future, we believe that FDA is going to be asking for details about end of life and end of service for any third-party software that is included in medical devices. Probably the final pre-market guidance will provide instruction on that. If software is known to have vulnerabilities, it is possible that FDA could deny clearance or approval on the basis of having vulnerabilities, especially if components are unnecessarily out of date. They are being maintained but not patched. You may be required to provide evidence of updates that are deployed. You need to have a good understanding of what proportion of your devices have been updated, and be able to maintain the logistics of that and describe why safety and essential performance, again, are not impacted. In the future, we suspect that end of service software is going to be denied, period. You should not be sending products to market that have end of service software components in them. You need to start planning now for end of service software and ensure that you are able to be future-proofed, so that if you're using, for example, a Microsoft operating system, you may only get a year of warning from Microsoft that they're going to take it out. They may be replacing it with another version. You want to make sure you understand what the requirements are there so that you're able to support that when it is released. Next slide. So these are the cybersecurity capabilities now required by law, starting in about 2 weeks. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure. You're going to need to have a policy statement that says this is how we will coordinate disclosures. There are lots of examples on the internet of companies that have published theirs. They're public facing. You can go out and find them, review them, and consider what portions are applicable to your device or your business model. You will need to have a vulnerability monitoring and management plan. Vulnerability management is a tricky area because it's not well characterized. There aren't a lot of standards that help you understand exactly what is asked for and how to perform it, but you're going to need to have a plan. You need to have a total product life cycle perspective. So you need to have a patching plan. You need to have a good explanation for what you do if you are required to engage in some kind of a cybersecurity recall. If you have corrections that need to get to market, you need to have a plan for how that will be conducted, and you need to provide security for the patching so that you have confidence that a patch can't be rolled back in a way that causes vulnerabilities that were present before to be exploitable again. And you need to have a solid understanding that the only thing that can be applied as a patch is something that you have control over and that is authentic. You will need to have software bill of materials. And again, software bill of materials are not standardized. There is a lot of discussion in industry. There's also discussion with HDOs about what SBOM should contain. That's not been fully agreed upon. Next slide. So White House is issuing a cybersecurity strategy. What's new with that? As of March 2nd, they released a public version of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. It's intended to provide strategic guidance for how the entire nation is going to protect the digital ecosystem. That's against malicious criminal actors. It's against nation-state actors. It argues that new and updated cybersecurity regulations need to be calibrated to meet the needs of national security and also public safety. So the public health mission is impacted by that. It indicates that the US needs to shift liability onto the entities that failed to take reasonable precautions. And that is important because they're saying basically at some point, medical device manufacturers are going to be liable for issuing devices with software that should have had hygiene applied and did not reasonably have that hygiene applied. But it also emphasizes the need to harmonize regulations and rules. And that's important because we know worldwide that there are not always convergences in terms of regulation and standards and what is considered best practice. And that is actually inhibiting innovation across the board. And it really adds confusion. So the United States is really engaging, Health Canada is engaging with IMDRF, trying to ensure that moving forward, most of these regulations are consistent around the world. There are calls for enhanced coordination between CISA and the sector risk management agencies, which would include DHS, potentially HHS as a secondary stakeholder, but they really want to see, ISOs and sector-focused information sharing and analysis centers engage and ensure that all of the stakeholders are communicating more clearly and more consistently. Next. So in addition to all of these issues, the appropriations bill provided FDA specifically with increased cybersecurity funding, $5 million to hire and to train staff to ensure that cybersecurity is being reviewed and is being managed. FDA is going to be publishing resources to help medical device manufacturers and HDOs understand the expectations. There will be a GAO report on legacy devices within the year. Senator Warner has separately issued a policy white paper last year where he's really focused on, what are the things that need to happen in order to ensure that this environment can move forward. Student loan forgiveness to ensure that there are staff who can support rural health care with cybersecurity skills, clarifying the increasing role of CISA as a federal agency, expanding and clarifying HHS accountability in healthcare delivery cybersecurity. Next.
Okay, thanks Naomi for the deep dive here. So I'm going to start to wrap up, and as I mentioned in the beginning in my introduction, I've been dealing with healthcare cybersecurity and medical device cybersecurity for 15 years now, and I think in the early days, many years actually, it basically was the operator's responsibility through operational measures to secure devices, right? Firewalls and network segmentation and whatnot. And it is still the reality today. What we have seen over the last few years through FDA regulations and regulations in other countries is something which we may want to call a shift left, in the sense that the security responsibility for new devices that are being designed right now is expected to lie more with the manufacturer than with the operator of medical devices. Not saying that the operator will never have any security responsibility, but it certainly should be reduced, because it's really the least desirable place where you should be securing things is on the user's network. But what we just went through, the review of regulations here in the US and abroad as well, really introduces another variation to this little matrix here, and that is a shift left and up, right? So we're shifting left. We say we need more secure devices, but we're also moving up and saying, by the way, cybersecurity is not just a technical responsibility. It is actually a leadership. It is actually an executive responsibility. And we've seen that in the White House cybersecurity strategy and the SEC policy and many other regulations that clearly are stating that that cybersecurity needs to be a top-level executive responsibility. So what is changing right now as we speak, and we've, I think, shown examples that substantiate that, is that these new regulations, laws, and strategies fundamentally will change where we secure, meaning more emphasis on the device rather than the network the device is operated on, and who is responsible for security, more on the manufacturer side, but also, again, the leadership responsibility for making sure that security is implemented within a given organization. So traditionally, we've seen a reactive response, right? It was incident driven. There was a cybersecurity breach, malware on a medical device. There was a new vulnerability that needed to be patched. There was a security event that then triggered action by the manufacturer and the operator of the device. Now we're moving towards a more protective approach where we have external compensating controls around devices. So we now have medical device security tools that hospitals can put on their networks that are specifically designed to help with securing, protecting medical devices on the network level and help with tasks like asset discovery, risk management, and so forth. But we also should be moving to a risk-based approach, because we can't react to everything, and everything is not equally important. We need a risk-based vulnerability management approach that helps us collectively to minimize the risk of devices on hospital networks or in the patient's home, for that matter. But again, looking at what these new regulations and strategies on a national level are telling us is basically we need to be proactive, become proactive on security. Right? Security has to be a default feature of a device, and even longer term, the device needs to be future-proof. So it not only needs to be secure when it is released, but the architecture and design of a device has to be such that it can be continually protected without having to jump through hoops and deploy patches all the time. So secure by design. The three boxes on the left, obviously, are the responsibility of the device operator, healthcare organization, whereas the three on the right, the one in the middle being shared, are more manufacturer responsibilities. And where we are today, we are indeed moving from the reactive approach on the left towards the future-proof, secure by design approach on the right, which has two advantages. One is it will result in a better security posture. The earlier we design security into a device, the more secure it will be, but also the lower will the cost of security be, because it is indeed cheaper to implement security up front than to do it externally to the device through expensive tools and significant risk management effort on the side of the operator. So again, we are right now kind of in the middle here, but if you look at the regulations and the timeline put in front of us through regulators, we're definitely shifting things towards a more future-proof state, and we need to start thinking about that. And how do we do that? One theme that is consistent is that of a secure software development lifecycle. So security is not only a property of a device, of course it is a property of a device, but the processes around the device, the engineering and security processes, are the ones that assure that the device is secured, security can be maintained, and the device during its useful life maintains its best possible security posture. Now, if you look at the life cycle, and there are many papers and books about software development lifecycle, but specifically looking at cybersecurity and medical devices, I like what the HIS Act published a couple of years ago, which basically breaks it down into 3 life cycles. The one on the upper left is the manufacturer as they go through the various stages of product development. Then the one on the upper right is the manufacturer's supply chain that need to be security risk managed. Then in the lower left, that is the healthcare delivery organization or other operator of the medical device that again has their tasks around security, and the manufacturer and the operator are connected through the maintenance lifecycle. We also need to realize that those wheels here are spinning at different speeds, so to speak. For the medical device manufacturer, the life cycle is per device or device type and version, whereas for the operator, it is per physical device. Right? I may buy one CT scanner this week and another one next year. I may end of life 10 infusion pumps this week, but keep the other 900 in operation for a while, right? So it is per device as compared to for the entire product line, which is the way the manufacturer looks at it. Now, obviously, this requires good planning, good documentation, and demonstration that you're actually doing what you say you will be doing. And if you take the wheel in the upper left and unfold that, you end up with something like this, which is a set of regulatory artifacts and activities that should be performed in the various stages of the development lifecycle at the manufacturer. And many times, you create a document and maintain it until your product is then eventually released. This is just one example how this can be done. There are others out there. And you as a manufacturer, I think, should look at which model does work best for you. Wrapping up here with a couple of other activities that are ongoing right now. I always like to point to the Health Sector Coordinating Council, or short HSCC, and their cybersecurity activities. And I encourage everybody to kind of look into it and potentially even join some of those activities. It's a public-private partnership, and it's a very open cooperation between government, device manufacturers, healthcare organizations, cybersecurity experts, and whatnot. And here's just a listing of examples of things that are happening within HSCC right now, or documents that have recently been released that can help you as a manufacturer of devices or as an operator of medical devices to establish your processes around known best practices. Very recently, actually, as early as this morning, we got an update, a second version of the HPH Healthcare Public Health Sector Cybersecurity Framework Implementation Guide, cooperation between HHS, ASPR, HSCC, and NIST, which is basically a healthcare and medical device specific implementation guide of the NIST critical infrastructure security framework. The initial document was released in 2015, I believe. And again, we just got today an update from HHS on, again, how to actually translate and implement NIST CSF in the healthcare industry. A couple of IEEE activities, and there are many, many, certainly. We picked just 2 examples. One, Naomi already mentioned, and she was actually deeply involved in developing, is the IEEE/UL 2621, which is very specific to wireless diabetes device security and evaluation of assurance of security of these devices. So this is certainly not applicable to every manufacturer out there, but if you work in the diabetes space, it certainly is. And then another one that is going to be published for public review fairly soon, within a couple of weeks, I would expect, is the IEEE UL 2933 TIP standards, and TIP standing for basically trust, identity, privacy, protection, safety, and security. This standard does a great job, I think, tying together the complexities of security, right? Because security really by itself has no purpose, right? If I need to design a secure device, my first question is, well, how secure, right? How secure does the data need to be? I need to look at privacy laws to tell me that. How safe does the device have to be? I need to look at FDA and other regulators to understand that. What is the level of trust I need to implement between devices or between devices and users? And only if I know these things and understand the regulatory and legal background can I determine the right level of security and security technology that I need to implement for my given device. And again, this standard should be out there for public review fairly soon, within a couple of weeks. And with that, it's a wrap. We got about 10 minutes left for questions.
So I see a question about products that are connected needing to meet certain cybersecurity testing or activities. What about medical devices that are not connected but process PHI and are used in the clinical environment? So this is an important distinction. The Appropriations Bill makes law that cyber devices, as defined, are required to have all this information in their submissions. The guidance still applies to the ORD version of that logic. You may have software or you may have vulnerabilities. Quite frankly, when you have software, you probably have vulnerabilities, or you can be connected to the internet. So you still apply the guidance documents, which are recommendations, to any device that has any kind of electronic interface. It could just be it has a USB port. But we know for a fact that malware is often distributed over USB devices. And there have been lots of studies that have shown if you distribute a bunch of USB dongles, throw them out in, a grassy field at a college, lots of people are going to pick them up and, insert them into computers out of curiosity, because, wow, great, I have a storage device and I've been really needing one. For a lot of reasons, people will just utilize these devices without considering the security and the privacy implications that go with that. So simply having a device that processes PHI, you may have privacy laws that also apply. You may have to be considering HIPAA. But the fact that it's connectable, or the fact that it contains data of that nature, means that you have to go review the guidance and see to what extent it applies and how it affects your risk management. It is still applicable as part of your quality system that you evaluate the risks associated with cybersecurity, even if a device does not fall under the specific cyber device definition under the law today. So you still have to apply the guidance. My recommendation is that if you have any kind of electronic interfacing to the device, even if it's not intended to be connected to, like a JTAG port internal to a component, people can open those up. I walk around with screwdrivers routinely. I may just, decide to pop your case open and see what's inside. If you have some kind of tamper resistance, that might be part of your story to FDA. But generally speaking, you still have to apply the guidance, and you're probably still going to have to provide a set of evidence and artifacts to FDA describing your cybersecurity risk analysis and any controls you have in place. And that typically includes threat modeling, where you analyze your system and its assets and the data that's stored on it and all of the different interactions that it has with other entities, whether those are humans or cloud connectivity or another device that it interoperates with, you need to assess the risk of an attack through one of those mechanisms. I see another question, or really it's more a comment. IEEE 2621 plans to extend beyond diabetes devices to include all medical devices. If you wanted to take a standard that is out there and is, at least in this case, one of the three is currently recognized by FDA, and apply it as take it and generalize it from diabetes, but apply it to other devices, this is a good example of one that lays out some clear, specific instructions on how to provide assurance. And that is not common right now. Many of the standards just give general guidelines, but there are not specific test methodologies that are described because they generally can't be applied to every device, and it's really hard to do that. So eventually 2621 is something that will generalize, and it can generalize nicely. There are also IEEE 11073 standards for point of care and personal health devices, which speak to a protocol agnostic, communications approach and include security metrics. And the Bluetooth special interest group actually addresses that for a Bluetooth specific approach with many of their services and profiles and their test suites.
And quickly back to the first question about connectivity. First of all, Naomi, I appreciate your USB thumb drive example. In fact, the very first medical device cybersecurity incident I was involved in back in 2009 involved a traveling service technician with a USB thumb drive, with a software update, and a piece of malware that he then introduced to a medication cabinet. And because all those cabinets were networked and running the same unpatched version of a end-of-life operating system, it actually shut down medication delivery across multiple hospitals of that organization, and they had to literally take them all off the network, rebuild them one by one, and then put them back on the network. So non-network security incidents do happen. Secondly, don't just look at regulations, right, or the regulations that apply directly to you as a medical device manufacturer. If there's PHI involved, I assume that your customer will start asking you, if they're not already are, how well you secure the PHI on the device, whether it is networked or not, doesn't matter. Your customer, the hospital, needs to comply with the HIPAA security and privacy rules with regards to PHI. And there actually have been in the past several medical devices that got stolen from hospitals, and the hospital had to file with HHS for a data breach under the breach notification law because of unencrypted PHI on a medical device. So it is not just about what FDA and others are telling you directly as a manufacturer. Look at the big picture and also try to understand what is impacting your customers as they need to comply with additional requirements, and in addition to the ones that affect you directly as a manufacturer. Quickly scrolling back here, if you look, for example, at the, okay, where is it now? The fourth bullet under HSCC, the model contract language for medical technology cybersecurity. That is actually a release document from HSCC that is currently actually being revised, but nevertheless, it's out there in the first version that actually provides healthcare providers with an example of language to use in contracts to stipulate what they should require from their suppliers, meaning the medical device manufacturers, in terms of cybersecurity of the device itself, cybersecurity documentation, as well as cybersecurity maintenance. And yes, the slides will be available. Somebody just asked. Okay, we still got 5 minutes left. Any more questions out there? If not, then thanks for joining. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day. You can always contact us directly. Here's our email contact information. And yes, as I said earlier, we will distribute the slides to the attendees. So thanks everybody and have a good day.
Thank you.